On the tarmac, with the afternoon sun casting a glow over the polished fuselage of his private jet, Marcus Carter was conducting his final pre-flight checks. To anyone watching, he looked like just another pilot, preparing for a routine trip. But Marcus's story was anything but ordinary. Standing there in his aviation uniform, clipboard in hand, he was not only the man who'd be flying this jet. He was the CEO of SkyBound Aviation, a company he had built from scratch, defying odds and overcoming obstacles at every turn. Marcus had spent years navigating an industry where faces like his were rare and often doubted. Despite his success, he was still no stranger to questioning looks and skeptical glances. Today, as he moved through his preparations with quiet determination, 2 police officers observed him from a distance. Their eyes narrowed with suspicion, lingering on him a little too long, as if silently questioning what he was doing there. He caught sight of their approach but kept his cool, focusing on the task at hand. The officers walked up to him, their expressions tight and uninviting. "Can we see some ID?" One of them asked, voice edged with distrust. They didn't wait for an answer before demanding more details. "Are you authorized to be here? This jet doesn't belong to you, does it?" Marcus looked at them calmly, handing over his ID without a word, feeling the familiar weight of judgment. They scrutinized his credentials, flipping through them as though expecting to find something amiss, something that would confirm their assumptions. It was clear they thought he didn't belong here. He wasn't the type they expected to see piloting, let alone owning a jet like this. As the officers continued to press, Marcus's patience held. Years of experience had taught him to handle these moments with quiet resolve, knowing that his truth needed no embellishment. Little did they realize they were questioning the very man whose name adorned the logo on the jet's tail, the man who owned not only this aircraft, but a fleet of others, all part of an empire he'd built against the odds. With a deep breath, Marcus prepared himself, ready for the moment when he would reveal his true identity, his achievements, and his ownership, a truth that would shift their assumptions entirely. But for now, he let them continue, knowing the revelation would be all the more powerful when it finally came. As Marcus Carter moved methodically through his pre-flight checklist, a sense of purpose guided each of his actions. This jet was his pride, his hard-won achievement, a symbol of everything he had built. But just as he finished checking the wing flaps, he noticed 2 police officers approaching, their eyes fixed on him with a steely, unwelcoming gaze. One of the officers cleared his throat, cutting through the quiet hum of the tarmac. "Sir, are you authorized to be here?" he asked, his voice laced with a suspicion that felt familiar, but no less frustrating. The other officer's expression was equally cold, his hand resting on his belt, fingers tapping with a subtle impatience, as though waiting for Marcus to make a wrong move. Marcus kept his posture relaxed, meeting their stares with a steady calmness. He'd encountered these kinds of assumptions before, moments where people looked at him and only saw what they expected to see, not who he truly was. He had learned long ago not to let it rattle him. "Yes," he replied evenly, reaching for his ID and flight documentation. "I'm the pilot." The officer took his ID, examining it as if expecting to find some discrepancy, something to justify his skepticism. "And this jet?" The officer continued, looking pointedly at the sleek aircraft behind Marcus. "It's not yours, is it?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, holding back the urge to correct the officer's tone. "Actually, it is," he replied, his voice steady. "I own this jet." The officer's brows lifted slightly, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was as if the idea didn't compute, as if Marcus's calm assurance in his ownership was somehow a puzzle that didn't fit the pieces they had arranged in their minds. But instead of backing off, the questioning grew more intense. "Mind if we take a look at your credentials?" The second officer chimed in, voice sharp and unwavering. "And we're going to need to know exactly what you're doing here today, Mr. Carter." The question, though worded professionally, carried an underlying message that Marcus understood all too well. They weren't just curious about his flight plans. They were probing, searching for something, anything, that would confirm their biases. Marcus handed over his documentation without hesitation, letting them scan through every page, every certificate, every official seal. But even as they read through each piece of proof, their scrutiny only grew. "You don't often see pilots in this sort of position," one officer muttered, almost to himself, as he thumbed through Marcus's paperwork, pausing here and there as if hoping to find a gap, a crack in the story. Marcus took a slow breath, willing himself to stay patient. He knew he didn't have to prove himself to anyone. His records were legitimate, his ownership indisputable. Yet standing there, under the officer's gaze, he could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him, an all too familiar reminder of the barriers he'd had to push through his entire career. The officers exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. They weren't satisfied, even with the proof laid out in front of them. One officer adjusted his stance, almost as if preparing for the next round of questioning, his gaze narrowing even further. Marcus stood his ground, maintaining his calm exterior, even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. He had learned to endure these encounters, but today the scrutiny felt heavier, more invasive, as if his very presence was an affront to their expectations. Still, he let them continue, knowing that every question they asked would only make the truth, when he finally revealed it, all the more undeniable. Marcus felt the tension mounting as the officers exchanged a final look, then motioned for him to step aside. They led him away from the jet and toward a small, sterile office just inside the terminal building. The hallway buzzed with activity as crew members and passengers moved past, some glancing at Marcus with mild curiosity. To them, he looked like any other man being escorted by the authorities, an image that the officers seemed intent on upholding. But Marcus stayed calm, his expression resolute as they reached the office and closed the door behind them. Inside, one of the officers gestured for him to take a seat. "We're going to need more information from you," he stated, not as a request, but as an order. Marcus took a breath, steadying himself. He had learned long ago not to let such moments break his calm. "Of course," he replied, setting his bag down and clasping his hands in his lap. The officers positioned themselves across from him, one flipping through the documents he had already provided, the other watching him closely, as if trying to detect any hint of deception. "So, Mr. Carter," the first officer began, his tone thick with skepticism, "why don't you tell us exactly what brought you here today?" Marcus looked him in the eye, unflinching. "I'm here on business, flying to meet with potential clients," he explained, his voice level. "SkyBound Aviation has been expanding rapidly, and I personally oversee these discussions to ensure everything aligns with our vision." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "SkyBound Aviation," he echoed, as though testing the words in his mouth. "And you're saying you're the owner of this company?" "Yes, I'm the founder and CEO," Marcus affirmed, his tone unyielding. The officer flipped through his documents once more, almost aggressively, before looking up with narrowed eyes. "Quite a setup you have here," he muttered. "You must have had some help to get this kind of operation off the ground." Marcus held back a sigh, recognizing the implication, but instead of rising to it, he remained silent, letting the officer continue. Each question, each insinuation only strengthened his resolve to stay calm, knowing that his credentials were indisputable. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," the second officer cut in, "where did you even get the funds for an operation like this? Seems a bit ambitious." Marcus met the officer's gaze, unflinching. "Years of hard work, determination, and some good business decisions," he replied firmly. "Every penny came from my own efforts." The officers exchanged a look of thinly veiled disbelief. It was clear they weren't satisfied, even as they sifted through pages of licensing documents, financial statements, and permits, all meticulously prepared by Marcus to cover any possible scrutiny. But the disbelief only grew as they failed to find a single inconsistency. In that moment, Marcus realized something important. It wasn't just his ownership they were questioning. It was his legitimacy, his right to hold this position of authority in an industry that didn't often see men like him at the helm. The officers weren't simply looking for evidence of his qualifications. They were searching for a reason to undermine his accomplishments. As the officers continued their questioning, Marcus's resolve deepened. They could prod, they could imply, they could cast doubt all they wanted, but he knew his worth. He had fought too long and too hard to let a few doubting glances shake him now. After a prolonged silence, the first officer leaned back, visibly frustrated. "All right," he said finally, his voice tight. "But we're going to verify every document you've given us. We'll need to contact the necessary authorities to confirm your claims." Marcus inclined his head, his expression unwavering. "Feel free. I have nothing to hide," he replied calmly. Little did they know, every document, license, and certification had been prepared with precision. Each paper was a testament to his dedication, to the years he had spent building his company from the ground up. Marcus knew that, given time, the truth of his accomplishments would be undeniable, no matter how deeply they tried to dig. As they continued to press him, their questions becoming increasingly repetitive, Marcus's patience held. Every insinuation, every doubt, only reinforced his determination to see this through to the end. He understood that his restraint now would make the eventual reveal all the more powerful. In the silence that followed, Marcus allowed himself a small, inward smile. The very obstacles they were throwing at him were simply adding weight to the moment when he would reveal his full identity, his accomplishments, and the vast reach of his company. And that moment was approaching. With each passing second, he could feel it drawing closer, the turning point he had been quietly preparing for. He sat back, waiting, ready for when the time would come to reveal the truth, when every single one of their doubts would be dispelled in an instant, and they would finally understand the full scope of who he was and what he had achieved. The questioning had stretched on for what felt like hours, but Marcus maintained his calm, watching as the officers cycled through every document, every certification, searching for something, anything that might prove him wrong. Finally, one of the officers, visibly frustrated, tossed the documents back onto the table with a slight sneer. "All right, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone dripping with doubt. "Everything appears to be in order, but it still doesn't add up. You're telling us you're not just a pilot, but somehow the owner of an entire aviation company." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady as he reached into his briefcase. He took out one last document, a simple, unassuming business card. He placed it on the table, sliding it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested in front of them. In bold letters, it read. The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism flickering into confusion, and then disbelief. Marcus allowed himself a small, calm smile as he broke the silence. "Gentlemen, you've spent all this time questioning my right to be here, assuming I'm out of place. But the truth is, you've been interrogating the CEO of this entire operation. I don't just fly this jet. I own it. And every aircraft bearing the SkyBound logo. That's my fleet." The room fell silent. The officers' faces went slack, the weight of their mistake settling in. Every assumption, every pointed question, every hostile glance, everything had been directed at the man who stood at the very top of the company they tried to undermine. They looked down at the business card, the words blurring as they realized the magnitude of their error. One of the officers cleared his throat, visibly struggling to compose himself. We didn't know," he stammered, his bravado slipping. "You have to understand, sir, we had to be thorough." Marcus cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "Thorough. There's a difference between being thorough and making baseless assumptions. You looked at me, and instead of seeing the man who built this company from the ground up, you saw someone who didn't fit the image in your minds. And because of that, you wasted hours questioning my legitimacy, my rights, and my authority. The other officer fidgeted, glancing down at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. "We apologize if there was a misunderstanding," he mumbled. Marcus's gaze remained unyielding. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he replied. "It was prejudice. I'd spent years in this industry, breaking down barriers and defying expectations, but encounters like this remind me just how far we still have to go. Every assumption you made was based on what you thought I couldn't be, rather than what I actually am." A heavy silence settled over the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their previous confidence completely evaporated. They were confronted not only with their mistake, but with the broader implications of their assumptions, forced to face the reality of how their biases had clouded their judgment. Marcus rose from his seat, gathering his documents with a quiet dignity. He looked back at the officers, his final words leaving a lasting impression. "I built this company to prove that anyone, no matter their background or appearance, can rise to the top if they work hard enough. Remember that the next time you decide to judge someone by how they look." Without another word, he walked to the door, leaving the officers in stunned silence, their earlier confidence shattered. As he stepped back onto the tarmac, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had worked so hard to build something so monumental. This encounter would be just another chapter in his story, another obstacle overcome in a journey defined by resilience and quiet strength. Back on his jet, as the engines roared to life, he felt the familiar surge of power and freedom. For every doubter, every naysayer, every person who assumed he didn't belong, had let his success be his response. As he soared into the sky, Marcus knew he was flying not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been underestimated. This was his story, his victory, and no one could take it away from him. As Marcus made his way back across the tarmac toward his jet, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on the two officers. They remained in the doorway of the terminal, watching him walk away with a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. Every step Marcus took felt like a quiet victory, each stride a testament to the strength he'd shown in facing down their doubts and assumptions. Word of the incident spread quickly among the airport staff and crew. Pilots, technicians, and ground crew exchanged glances and whispers, some even casting embarrassed looks at Marcus, realizing the magnitude of the officer's mistake. Here was the CEO of SkyBound Aviation, a man who'd broken barriers and built an empire, treated with suspicion simply because he didn't look the part others expected. One of the airport managers, who had caught wind of the situation, approached Marcus as he reached his jet. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry for any inconvenience this caused," he said, his voice laced with genuine regret. "Please know that we respect you and the work you've done in this industry. This shouldn't have happened." Marcus nodded, appreciating the sentiment but keeping his response measured. "I appreciate your words," he replied. "But this isn't just about inconvenience. It's about respect and understanding that we belong in places we've earned, regardless of how others may perceive us." The manager lowered his head, clearly affected by Marcus's words, and vowed quietly to address the situation with the officers. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, Mr. Carter," he said sincerely. As Marcus stepped onto his jet, he felt a shift in the atmosphere around him. The crew members who had initially looked at him with skepticism now watched him with admiration, a newfound respect evident in their faces. They had witnessed his dignity in the face of prejudice, his calm strength even as others tried to undermine him. And in that moment, Marcus knew he'd reclaimed not just his rightful position, but had gained the respect of those who had doubted him. Back inside the terminal, the officers faced questions of their own from their supervisor, who had been notified of the incident. There would be a review of their actions, an investigation into the assumptions that had led them to target Marcus with such intensity. It was a small but significant step toward accountability, a reminder that biases have consequences and that power used carelessly could not go unchecked. From his vantage point in the cockpit, Marcus looked out over the tarmac, a quiet sense of triumph settling over him. He'd handled this ordeal with composure and resilience, proving once again that no amount of doubt could diminish his accomplishments or his place in this industry. As he prepared for takeoff, he reflected on the path that had brought him here, the years of hard work, the battles he'd fought, and the barriers he'd broken. As his jet lifted into the sky, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just flying for himself. He was soaring for everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. And now he had a story to tell, a story of resilience, of quiet strength, and of justice served in the most dignified way possible. For those who had doubted him, who had questioned his right to be here, this would be a lasting lesson. Marcus Carter, CEO of SkyBound Aviation, was not only the pilot of his own destiny, but a symbol of what was possible when one defied every expectation. And as he flew higher, leaving the airport and all its judgments behind, he knew his journey was just beginning, carrying with it the power to inspire others to break through every boundary and rise above. As Marcus's jet climbed steadily into the clouds, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on everything he had endured to reach this point. Every obstacle, every doubt, every sideways glance, and whispered remark. They had all been part of the journey. He knew that his success hadn't come easy, and it hadn't come by conforming to what others expected of him. It had come from relentless determination, an unwavering belief in his own vision, and the quiet strength to keep moving forward when others questioned his right to be there. In that small office, facing down prejudice with dignity, Marcus had shown that true strength often speaks the loudest in silence. He didn't need to argue or justify his place. His accomplishments spoke for themselves. The respect he earned was not through confrontation, but through resilience, through proving that he belonged by simply standing his ground. As he flew through the open sky, Marcus knew that his journey represented more than just personal achievement. He was part of a larger story, a story of breaking barriers and redefining what was possible. And he knew that for every person like him who had fought to be seen, there were countless others still waiting for their chance to rise, still hoping to be recognized for who they truly were. Marcus understood that strength is not about overpowering others or forcing respect. It's about embodying the qualities that demand it naturally. He had taught himself, and those who had doubted him, a profound lesson. That real power doesn't rely on approval or validation from anyone. Real power is knowing who you are, regardless of what others assume. As the jet cruised above the clouds, Marcus allowed himself a small, proud smile. He had proven, once again, that no amount of doubt or prejudice could ground him. He was free, soaring higher than any assumption could reach, carrying with him the unshakable truth of his own worth. In that moment, he felt not only victorious but grateful for the journey, for every challenge that had made him stronger, every misjudgment that had only fueled his rise. And as the world spread out beneath him, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He would continue to rise, inspiring others to follow, showing them that with patience, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit, there are no limits to how high one can soar.